John Armstrong, also with KNN Public Finance, and Graham Beck with Nixon Peabody, representing as bond counsel, should there be any questions that come up along those lines. We actually have two presentations tonight, one of which will be heard by the board as a whole tomorrow evening. These presentations deal with an overview of the district's bond program, providing information generally on general obligation bonds, but also specifically on West Contra Costa's bond program, and then more specific detail as it relates to the 2015 bond issuance. So with that, so just to take a step back and look at what was presented to the Facilities Subcommittee in September of 2014, we looked at several scenarios of assumptions and what drives a bond issuance schedule for the district's entire bond program. And as Ms. LeBlanc alluded to earlier, those two primary assumptions are tax rates and assessed valuation growth. And so with that, when planning for the 2015 bond issuance, we looked at some key assumptions as it relates to baseline that have been used by the district time and time again, which is a 4% assessed valuation growth assumption, and I'll get into more details as it relates to what drives that 4%. It also looks at a $48 tax rate. That $48 tax rate coincides with the information that was shared with voters when going out for the 2010 Measure D, 2012 Measure E. So those are the two assumptions that we focused on back in September. We also focused on, based on interest conveyed from the board, in using current interest bonds only for the upcoming 2015 bond sale. So those were the drivers. And so we did show in that same meeting several different scenarios for informational purposes only on what could change the issuance schedules based on modified assumptions, whether it be assessed valuation growth or tax rates. And so we'll get into that here. But before we do, I want to visit what that baseline scenario assumption suggests as it relates to individual issuances. So on this page here, we're looking at, for the upcoming fiscal 2014-15 issuance, calendar year 2015, of $135 million. This would be comprised of $50 million from 2010 Measure D and $85 million from 2012 Measure E. And then we would follow in every other year issuance cycles to access the remaining issuance. I will note that at $48 tax rate and 4% assessed valuation growth, what we're noting here is a portion of the authorizations that would be deferred and not be issued in that every other year cycle ending in 2021. It would actually be pushed out to an anticipated amount beyond 2040 if assessed valuation growth did not allow for that money to be pulled forward. So this is our baseline scenario, which includes the upcoming 2015 issuance of $135 million. Now on this next page, we're looking at the district's historical assessed valuation growth. This is important data which allows the financial advisor to communicate with district staff and ultimately make recommendations to the board on what assumptions to use. And what this page shows us, that over a 30-year history, the district has moved up and down, but on an average assessed valuation growth has arrived at roughly 4.94%. So it hasn't quite hit the 5% average assessed value growth level. And at 15 years, it's even less, it's just below 4.5. And if you get to the more recent term, when it really is factoring into the recent economic recession, you can see those numbers drop considerably. Although it's important to note that in 14-15, we did see assessed valuation growth almost to 11%, just south of that. So what happens is there's going to be volatility in the future, and so the idea behind projecting forward is to arrive at a reasonable and conservative level of assessed valuation growth that will allow the district to maintain its targeted tax rate. So with all that being said, just want to show for information's sake only an alternative scenario that was presented back in September, which looks at 5% assessed valuation growth and what that does. And as you can see on this page here, the tail that was projected out is now being able to, is pulled forward into the final issuance in roughly 2021 timeframe. The acceleration of money isn't much greater than that. The tail is removed. I will say that there is some flexibility within this scenario to move some authorization forward, but there is limits to being able to do that. Now we're showing another alternative scenario for information purposes only at a 6% assessed valuation growth.
Yeah, please do. One of the questions, or one of the comments was about the use
Turn
of,
up the mic, please, John.
one of the comments was about the use of 40-year bonds. And I just wanted to point out that the basic reason to initially look at 40-year bonds is driven by the assumption of $48 tax rate and 4% AV growth. Some of these scenarios that we're talking about now would not require 40-year bonds. They could be done with 30-year bonds, for instance. So that's
So
another.
we're looking at this one right now, this would be 30 years?
Yeah, probably could be, yes, at 6% AV growth.
Well, what do you mean probably could be? Is it or isn't it? Will it be or won't it be?
To tell you the truth, I don't recall what the detail behind this one does. I know that the detail behind the 5% AV one was constructed on 30-year bonds.
You know, the 5% was constructed.
Yes.
Okay.
So that's another effect of how well the district manages to do with AV growth and what tax rates you will give. So.
Ms. Gamba?
Yes, just to make one comment about the AV. So when we sell bonds, we have to sign a document that says that we believe that those AV rates, will be reasonable and that the tax rates would be, at or below the legal limit. And so if we were to say something like a 6%, we would have to have some level of assurance, some kind of research that would ensure that we would, during that 30-year period, that we really believe that that could happen. And so these are numbers for the purposes of conversation, but at this point in time, 6% wouldn't be something that anybody would actually consider signing. We talked about that in September, that 4% is a rational number for this district. These numbers are just for purposes of illustration. Okay.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
That's right, and another key point here is we're talking about bond issuance, a schedule that stretches over quite a period of time. And so when we're talking about structuring and the term of those structures for, say, the 2021 issuance, the last issuance, when we're projecting that AV forward, but there's a lot of actual new data that becomes available between now and when we're actually looking at it. So that also will impact our ability to shorten the term to whatever is actually needed to access that remaining authorization in 2021. So it all plays into each other on how those structuring decisions work. So outside of the alternative assessed valuation growth scenarios that we're showing for informational purposes, we also in September looked at different tax rate scenarios. And the first of which we're showing here is going up to the district's statutory tax rate limit of $60 per 100,000 of assessed value, and what that would equate to as it relates to an issuance cycle, should that decision be made by the board. And as you can see, with that level of tax rate increase, it certainly impacts the ability to access that remaining